We have finished setting up the Sermon on the Mount with the first section, which was what's referred to as the Beatitudes, where Jesus gave his disciples four qualities that he expected his disciples to construct their character upon, that their character might be strong. And then he also spoke to them about the things that they could expect to see in terms of they were going to, of course, face some obstacles, but to remember that those obstacles that they were facing was because of him, not because of them, and that they would be blessed if they built their character as he instructed them to, but also be blessed because they endured the persecution that would come their way. And the other meaning of the word blessed, of course, in the original language means happiness. So they would be happy also as they endured whatever might befall them. We talked briefly on Sunday. Well, after the Beatitudes, of course, we talked about Jesus' teaching on the salt and the salt of the earth and the light of the earth that his disciples were to be. And then on Sunday, we talked about Jesus and his relationship to the law and the fact that he lived under the old law, so he was obligated, and so were his disciples to abide by the law. And in everything that Jesus did, never once did he violate the law that he lived under. And so the point that Jesus was making is that whatever law is in effect, that's what we're to abide by. And the time he was ministering, of course, the law that was in effect was the law that was given to Moses, and that is what his disciples were to abide by. But he was also setting up that there would come a time, as the prophecies had told them all, that there would be a time when that old law, once Jesus had fulfilled everything in that old law, there would be a new covenant, there would be a new law that would come into effect, and that would be the new law by which all mankind, including especially his disciples, would then be able to or would have to abide by. And then we go to verse 20 of chapter 5. Matt touched on this briefly in his sermon on Sunday, so I won't belabor a lot of the points, but I do want to make sure that we understand the purpose of what Jesus said in the 20th verse of chapter 5, when he said, unless your righteousness exceeds, some versions say surpass, that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And what he was telling them was that don't assume that if you just live the same way or abide, in the law that is to come, in the same way that the scribes and the Pharisees have abided by the old law. Don't assume that that's what's going to happen under the new kingdom, because the way that the scribes and the Pharisees have been using the old law is not the way that God intended that they use the law. And so he's giving them a warning. And he will use this phrase over and over and over again as he continues his Sermon on the Mount and his teachings. Even after the Sermon on the Mount, you'll also see some of his future teachings. You have heard it said, but I say to you. And so he's making it clear that whatever they have learned in the past, that's going to be replaced by what he is going to tell them. Now, this one verse, the 20th verse of chapter 5, sets up the rest of the discourse in the Sermon on the Mount, because it sets the stage for him to begin to contrast the old with the new. What was wrong with the old, and it wasn't, we'll find out that he's not talking about there was anything wrong with the old law. It was the application of the old law that was the problem. But he's going to contrast that with what's going to be under the new law of the kingdom of heaven. Now, if you want to jot this down, read the 23rd chapter of Matthew. The 23rd chapter of Matthew exposes Pharisaism. Okay? He goes into a lot of detail about the way that the Pharisees and the scribes had not only taught but had lived under the old law. And he will expose all of their misapplications, their misinterpretations, their abuses, and their misuses of the old law. The first 4 verses, for instance, in chapter 23 of Matthew, the Pharisees were known to do as I say, not as I do, right? They'd say, this is the way you're supposed to do it, and then they would not role model that very same thing that they were expecting the people. So while they often taught the truth, they did not often practice the truth. And there's an indication that the saying that some parents have come up with, or some people have come up with, that do as I say and not as I do, that's where that came from, and that was the way that the Pharisees behaved. They were known also to do things just to be seen by men. They loved to put all their robes and their phylacteries on and sit in the prominent seats just to be seen by men. Look at me. This is who I am. Had nothing to do with what their official responsibilities were and what God had entrusted them to do. They loved being in those places of high honor, which, of course, is not unusual to be seen even today in the religious world. There are lots of religious world people who love to carry fancy titles and love to be seen by men and love to have those places of honor, even though they are not deserved. They were known to neglect certain parts of the law. They didn't have a problem, or they didn't mind handling the little, the less heavy things, because those were easy to adjudicate and to take care of. But when it really came down to the real serious or the real burdensome parts of the law, they backed off from that, or they would modify the law so that it fit with what they actually wanted to have done or what they wanted to do. From that, we get the expression in the religious world that they majored in the minors and they minored in the majors. Now, in Luke the 16th chapter, verses 13 through 15, they were known to be lovers of money. In Luke the 16th chapter, verses 13 through 15, that's where Jesus' teaching was you cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve mammon or wealth, which is what the mammon stood for. Okay? You cannot serve two masters at the same time. And the Pharisees loved to make wealth their priority in life. That was their God. That was the wealth. They used it as an object of worship, and they used it as their top priority instead of keeping God as their priority. And again, not unlike some that we see in today's religious world. And so we do want to make it clear, though, that while Jesus was exposing all of this Pharisaical hypocrisy, that he was indicting in a general way the Pharisees and the scribes. By no way, shape, or means was that the attitude of all Pharisees or all scribes. You remember a very famous in the book of John especially, Pharisee Nicodemus. That's right. Okay? Nicodemus was a Pharisee, and he was sincerely interested in what Jesus had to say. And he would secretly come to Jesus at night to hear Jesus teach him so that he could come to a better understanding of what God's law was. And then later on, he was also with one other Pharisee after Jesus was crucified, Do you remember who that other Pharisee was? Who helped take care of Jesus' body after he was crucified? Joseph of Arimathea. Okay? Joseph of Arimathea. Okay? So certainly Jesus, that while we can speak in generalities, even today we can speak about, not all the religious world is corrupt. Hopefully we're not corrupt. Okay? Although we do know that there is corruption even in the Lord's church, unfortunately. But the point being is that Jesus was speaking in a general way about the tendencies that many of them had, even though there's always and will always be exceptions. And what Jesus is really saying is that this is the way that the Pharisees have behaved, but I expect more. This is what I am going to expect. I'm going to expect much more in the kingdom of heaven. And so we learn from the Sermon on the Mount that we cannot say to do something and then don't do it ourselves, or are not willing to do it ourselves. We can't do things just to be seen by men. It's not about impressing men. It's about being obedient to God and practicing the truth. Okay? We can't neglect some of the commandments, just the ones the ones we don't like, we kind of set off to the side and neglect those, and we just stick to the ones that are very easy to comply with. Okay? And we certainly cannot be lovers of wealth. That's not to say, again, that's not to say that there's anything in and of itself wrong with being wealthy. Okay? What we're saying is it can't be your priority in life. Okay? You still have to keep God as your priority in life. And so, when we think about what it is that Jesus is going to expect, he serves it as a warning to those of his disciples, and by extension, us as Christians, that we must combine our faith with the deeds that match our faith, with the suitable deeds that match our faith. Okay? James 2:14 through 17 talks about faith versus works. Faith and works being together, that works is a reflection of your faith. Okay? No, we don't earn our way to heaven by our works. We earn our way to heaven by our faith. But our works is a reflection of our faith. Okay? And James goes on to talk about those that are, if you find someone who is in need of food or clothing, and you just look the other way, you tell them, here, go on about your way, then that's not matching works with your faith. Okay, we must keep our private lives consistent with our public life. We cannot profess to be a Christian and then live some other way that's contrary to that in our private life. By that we mean, what's a good example of that? When you stop and think about folks who leave the building and then go down and, let's say, in America we used to call them, what do you used to call them, the slop shoots or whatever they were? Go hang out at the bar or whatever, okay, and get all tanked up, go out into town, get arrested for drunken disorderly or whatever, okay? That's not matching your Christianity. So, and then you come back into the building and you act like a holier than thou Christian, okay? That just doesn't fit with what Jesus expects of his efforts. And we must always make diligent efforts to observe all that Jesus has commanded. Remember, Matthew 28:20, okay? The instruction to the disciples, I'll be right with you. The instruction to the disciples were, teach them to obey all that I have commanded them. Okay? Not just part of it or the parts they like, but all that I have commanded them. Yes. It could be. It could be. Absolutely. Okay? Absolutely. Okay. So, Verse 20 sets us up then to begin to go then and start looking at any other comments or questions about verse 20 of chapter 5. Then let's look at this first contrast that Jesus talks about. And we can call it the anger that kills. Okay? I think the lesson calls it anger versus murder. So what Jesus is going to do now, he's going to start using contrast. This is what you have heard, but this is what I tell you. And when he says that, he's saying it because there has been something wrong with the application of whatever that law was. And he begins with, you shall not murder. Now, I know the old King James language says, you shall not kill, but that's not the proper word that was used in the original language. That was Old English translation, mistranslation of the original language. Murder, it means, and that's based upon other scriptures, for instance, in Proverbs and other places where we're talking about shedding innocent blood. Okay? It is not murder if you are in a combat situation and you know, in war or whatever. It's not murder if you're in law enforcement and somebody's trying to do you in and you have to retaliate. That's not murder. It's shedding innocent blood that we're talking with here. Now, you shall not murder, Exodus 20, verse 13. Before we close there, I will give you some other scriptures. To look at that will help you understand that that wasn't the only place. When God delivered the law to Moses, that wasn't the only place that he talked about not shedding innocent blood. Do you remember the first, and I'm not talking about Cain versus Abel, okay? Do you remember the first time when he said, you shall not take another man's life? You remember the first time when God said that? Go back into Genesis. Okay? Think about what's transpired. Okay? Noah and his family have come out of the ark. Okay? And the rainbow is there. Okay? And God is talking about going forth. Okay? You shall not take another person's life. And then there are other parts of the old law where where God explains what he means by not taking another person's life when they don't deserve it, for lack of any other term. You know, I don't know that anybody deserves to die, but the point being is that there are times when you're not committing murder just when someone gets killed. Okay, it's not always. It always not. That was the biggest one that God spoke about, was the presumptuous killing, laying in wait. That's definitely murder. Okay, there could be a murder committed though when you weren't necessarily lying in wait. Okay, but the point being is that it has to be such that no innocent blood is involved. Okay, because if innocent blood is involved, Lord knows there's lots of innocent blood that is being murdered nowadays. Okay, we don't have to think too hardly about that. So that is the meaning of murder. Okay, and so Jesus will now tell them this is the traditional way that it has been interpreted. This is the way that it's been interpreted by the Pharisees and by the scribes. It's not the law itself. That's not what God intended. And then he will go on to explain what he means by that. So let's take a look at Matthew, the 5th chapter. And let's read verses 21, beginning in verse 21. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court or shall be subject to judgment or something like that. In the old New King James says. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court, and whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court, and whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. So, what Jesus is saying here is that this is what the law said: do not commit murder. But I'm telling you that what God really meant was, don't abuse your brethren. Don't abuse other people. Okay? And the way that you can do that is to vent your anger at them for whatever the reason is. For whatever the reason is. Okay? And you start verbally abusing them. Calling someone a fool is about as insulting as you can ever be to someone. Calling them stupid, okay? Ignorant. That's what fool means anyway. It's being a fool in the Bible sense is about being ignorant of the law, but that's not what he's addressing here. What he's talking about is you setting yourself above the other person and running the person down verbally, abusing them. So when you abuse other people, that's really what the essence of that law was all about. Was not treating others fairly. Yes? Right. Uh, what version are you reading from? Okay. Matthew 23:3. That's the verse you were referring to? Okay. And what does that mean to you when you read it? Okay. That's right. Because what he has done, what he's doing is he's exposing them their hypocrisy. Okay. Yeah. They're telling you how to apply the law, and they're telling you how to apply it incorrectly. Okay? They preach a good sermon, but they don't live it. um, they absolutely. The traditions that the scribes and that the Pharisees and the scribes were giving to the Jews, the Israelites, was their own application of God's law. And in most cases, started way back even when they went into the promised land, even before that, they used it to their own purpose. Not to what God wanted to have happen, not to what God intended the law to be, but the way they wanted the people to abide by it. And what they would do is they would tell them, for instance, they would tell them what the truth said, but they would also not practice what they preached. Okay? And so let's go back to verse 1. Then Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. In other words, they've set themselves up as though they were Moses, as they were the great prophet Moses. Therefore, all that they tell you, do not do and observe. They'll tell you the truth, okay? But do not do according to their deeds. So you see them, the way they do it, don't do it that way, because that's not the way it's supposed to be. They're teaching the truth, but they're not living the truth, is basically what it's saying. That's exactly right. but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and they do not do them. Okay? Okay. Any other questions? You talking about when he saw the Egyptian beating another slave? Is that what you're talking about? Was that murder? That's not my place to say. No, I'm serious. I'm serious because Jack may say one thing and I may say another, but it's what God thinks that matters. Okay, the man was beating one of his countrymen, right? Was beating one of his countrymen. Okay, what's that? Well, but you may not plan. You may not plan to get into a fight with someone. You end up in a fight and you end up killing them. That doesn't make you right. You know. The point is, and this is going to be especially important on Sunday and Wednesday when we talk about marriage, adultery, and divorce. There's not going to be what ifs. We're going to read what the Bible says, and then that's it. Okay? Because you could what if yourself ad infinitum, and we'd never get anything settled. Okay? So I do know this, that when it was clear that someone did a misdeed, for instance, David, God made it clear in Scripture that David was wrong. And David repented of that wrong. So he recognized that he was wrong too. Okay? So we just have to be careful about judging incidents that are isolated from the context. Okay? Right. Okay? And that's true. That's true just about anything we run across. Okay? But getting back to our study now, the traditional way was for the Pharisees and the scribes to lead the Israelites by teaching them the law but not practicing it themselves. That's what it means by not doing as I say rather than what I do. And so Jesus will continue to say, "You have heard that it was said," or "You have heard the ancients were told, but I say to you." Okay? So the traditional interpretation and the application is, okay, whoever murders will be in the danger of the judgment or liable to the court. It of course refers to the local courts. All right. The Supreme Court in this case would be the Sanhedrin. Okay. It's interesting that under the Jewish form of law, their religious, and their civil and the criminal was all one court. Okay, there was no separation of church and state. Okay, the Sanhedrin was headed by a high priest, and then it saw all. It had the jurisdiction over all matters related to the Jews, whether it was spiritual or civil or criminal. But this interpretation, of course, sounds fine in the way it's presented, but evidently it did not go far enough. So the questions that are posed by this traditional teaching and the application are: was the law only concerned about the actual act of murder? Okay. And the other question is, should the disciples of Jesus also limit their concern to just actual acts of murder? Jesus tells them what the real essence of that law is all about. It's about the condition of the heart. It's about the condition of the attitude, and especially your attitude toward your fellow man, more importantly, your brethren. Okay? So, one who is angry with the brother, and this is what Jesus is saying. One who is angry with a brother, verbally abuses them, angry not in a righteous sense, but just angry. Okay? Some people just get angry. I mean, that's whether they have a temper problem or whatever. The point is that they get angry, or they will abuse other people. You call them, verbally abuse them. You call them fools, or whatever the case may be, okay? Which normally the courts would handle. They are worthy of, according to Jesus, what is the fiery hell that's talked about there? The Greek word is Gehenna. Anybody remember what Gehenna is? What's that? It's that place in the realm of hell where eternal punishment goes upon the condemned. It's eternal punishment. So what Jesus is saying here is that you abuse your brethren, you deserve to be in eternal punishment. Just like the criminals, just like the actual murderers, because that's the court, because that's the kind of people that the courts normally handle, are criminals. And so in your heart, you have become a criminal when you treat other people that way. Okay? So the judgment normally accorded to murderers is now deemed worthy of those whose anger led to even something as, well, we call it simply verbal abuse. Whether it's verbal abuse, physical abuse, or whatever. Jesus says one's just as bad as the other. Now, Jesus' teaching on this was not contrary to the old law. Proverbs, the 6th chapter, verses 16 through 19. Remember, talks about all those things that God hates, that are an abomination to him. And what is one of those things? Well, let's talk about two things. Two things, really important, okay? Hands that shed innocent blood, and what else? The heart that does what? Devises strife or grief. Where? Among brethren. God hates those. That is an abomination to him. That ought to be a clear warning to any of us, to any Christian walking around this earth today. You want to create havoc within the church? You want to create havoc within your brotherhood? That's an abomination. God hates that. And what Jesus is saying, it's worthy of the same thing that would happen to a criminal. Because that's how detestable it is to God. And I don't know why we Christians have such a hard time figuring that out. I think it's just simply because we've done just like the Pharisees have. We've pushed some of that stuff off to the side and we said, well, that's not that terribly important or whatever. And we've gone out about our business about abortion or other things without realizing that we could be doing the same thing if we sow discord among our brethren. Say again? You're right. It is if it's about self, but even if it's not, it could be done in a general way. It could be done in a general way, and I'm not going to go too far with that. Okay, all right, but that's not too distant in our past, of course. Okay, so the traditional interpretation of and application of the God's law had fallen short, and that's what Jesus is saying. Okay, the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees only condemning murderers without realizing about all of these other abuses of the law, that those misapplications, those things of the heart, made those people just as guilty as that murderer, that criminal would be. And the righteousness of the kingdom would need to be in harmony with the original intent of that law. The law taught to forsake wrath and anger. Psalm 37:8 says, put it out of your life. Forsake wrath and anger. And it also harmonizes with the righteousness that is expected of the kingdom today. What does Ephesians 4:31 say? Among those, okay? I'm just going to paraphrase obviously. Bitterness, wrath, anger, let all of those be put away. Keep them out of your life, get them out of your life. And of course, Galatians, the 5th chapter, verses 19 through 21, when it describes the deeds of the flesh, okay, has, of course, their outbursts of anger and strife. Okay? So, Jesus was illustrating the seriousness of anger to say this, that wrong emotions toward others kills that relationship with others, but more importantly, it kills your relationship with whom? With God Himself. That was the original intent of the law, and that's what the application has to be in the kingdom of heaven. Yes. Toward Jesus, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great illustration, a great illustration. The way that they were treating Jesus in and of itself was a misapplication of that law and was exercising there. Okay, so anger toward our fellow man can kill our relationship with God as well as murder our relationship with our fellow man. And ultimately, then who does that ruin? Absolutely. We end up ruining ourselves when we practice that. We ruin ourselves. So you don't have to be guilty of the actual act of murder to be guilty of murder, because that's what Jesus is talking about. And that is when you have the wrong attitude and the wrong condition of the heart. So Jesus is calling upon all of His disciples to deal with the anger that is an unrighteous anger. Deal with it. Get it out of your life, and keep it out of your life, because all it's going to do is destroy you. That's what's going to happen. And if you want to be one of my disciples, it needs to not be a part of your life. Okay, any last questions or anything before we get to the questions? We've got about a couple minutes here to address questions. There's only a few questions, so any other comments, questions? Did I answer your question, boy? I hope, it basically what Jesus has always been saying is, we have to remember that the Pharisees were the only source of religion that the Jews had. And because they had been leading the Jews for so many years, they knew what the law said, because, some of them could read, if not, I know that illiteracy was high then, but some of them could read, and all these had been passed down through tradition, and the whole law was read how many times? Once what? Once a year? Yeah, the whole law, the whole entire law was read once a year, okay, to the entire congregation, the entire congregation of Jews. Okay, all right. Okay, so let's go to our questions then. Let's do 23 first. And again, I will use the individual study guide questions because they are more inclusive, but I'll also tell you the number that matches with the Bible class discussion questions. Okay. What's the longest segment of the Sermon on the Mount? And let me go through these real quickly because we're running out of time here. Matthew, the 5th chapter, verses 17 through 48. Okay. Number 2 is also number 1 on the other list. Describe Jesus' relationship to the law. He came to fulfill it, not to abolish it. Okay? Number 3, what was Jesus' attitude toward many of the man-made traditions? He objected to the many misinterpretations and misapplications of the law, not the law itself. Number 4, which is number 2 on Bible class, what is the meaning of Jesus' statement not to abolish, but to fulfill? He didn't come to just toss it aside or do away with it, destroy it, but to fulfill it by meeting all the conditions of it. Number 5, the Old Testament was a covenant between God and whom? The Jews or the nation of Israel. Number 6, which is number 4 on the other list, how did Jesus fulfill the law? 3 ways. He fulfilled all the prophecies, he kept the commands himself, and he accomplished all that God had sent him to do. Is the law still binding on God's people today? And how do we know that? I mean, it makes sense, right? If Jesus fulfilled all the law, it's no longer any good, right? It's done away with, okay? And when Jesus preached his sermon, was the law still in force? Yes, okay? When did he, what is John, I think it's in John, trying to think of what chapter. What did Jesus say before he gave up his physical breath on the cross? What did he say? It is finished. The old law was fulfilled at that point. Okay? All right. Now, lesson 24. Number 1, in the 10 commandments, why did the 6th commandment say, you shall not murder? What did it say? Number 2, how did Paul incorporate the basic requirement into the new covenant in Romans 13:9? He summed it up in this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? Number 3 was number 1 on the Bible class questions. What is the relationship between murder and anger? Anger can be the motive for murder. Number 4, what was Jesus' warning against the motive for murder? It was a barrier to what? If you're angry with your brother, what is it a barrier to? To worshiping God. Okay? Remember, we didn't read the verses, but if you read the material, the verses continue. If you go to worship God to provide your gift, and remember that you have something against a brother, what? Go take care of that first, and then come back. Okay? And then come back and provide your gift. What are the circumstances that can lead to murder? Disagreements, verbal abuse. Okay? Just examples. And number 6, what is the importance of working out disagreements and differences quickly so that they don't lead you to make stupid decisions that could, the Bible says, you could end up in jail because of it, okay? And remember, we're not just talking about the physical. You can be spiritually imprisoned also. Okay? You can be spiritually imprisoned also. Okay, so Sunday we take up lesson 25, okay? Don't just read the material on the adultery and divorce. Please go back and write down a bunch of scriptures on God's intent for marriage, because that's the start. That's where we're going to start. Is what was God's intent for marriage, and then we'll get to the negative side of that. And thank you very much.